And so my name is Karen Ferridan. I'm with the Voices Coalition. A lot of you know me. But I'm fortunate to also work with Carolyn Raffensperger, our speaker today, in a different organization having to do with CO2 pipelines. And so I'm very excited to be able to introduce her as our speaker for the day. Carolyn Raffensperger is the executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. As an environmental lawyer, she specializes in the fundamental changes in law and policy necessary for the protection and restoration of public health and the environment. Carolyn is co-editor of Precautionary Tools for Reshaping Environmental Policy, published by MIT Press in 2006, and Protecting Public Health and the Environment, Implementing the Precautionary Principle, published by Island Press in 1999. Together, these volumes are the most comprehensive exploration to date of the history, theory, and implementation of the precautionary principle. Carolyn coined the term ecological medicine to encompass the broad notions that both health and healing are entwined with the natural world. She has served on editorial review boards for several environmental and sustainable agriculture journals and on US EPA and National Research Council committees. She wrote a bi-monthly column for the Environmental Law Institute's journal Environmental Forum from 1999 until 2008. Carolyn has been featured in Gourmet Magazine, The Etny Reader, Yes Magazine, The Sun, Whole Earth, and Scientific American. Along with leading workshops and giving frequent lectures on the precautionary principle, Carolyn is at the forefront of developing new models for government that depend on these larger ideas of precaution and ecological integrity. The new models include guardianship for future generations, a vision for the courts of the 21st century, and the public trust doctrine. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for being with us. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, the bios never actually tell you the interesting things. But I thank you very much for having me. And I want to give you a little background about how we got into this, how I met Karen. And then I'm going to give you the fundamentals around CO2 pipelines because they'll be coming to a region near you. A year ago in June, I read in the Des Moines Register that a couple of corporations were planning on building CO2 pipelines. I care about the climate. So, it just seemed to me like, couldn't this be a good idea? Couldn't it be a climate solution? But the people behind it are notoriously bad actors. So I was instantly suspicious, and we put together a group very quickly of people who'd worked on pipelines in the Midwest. So I happen to live in Iowa, and I live within a mile and a half, just a little under 2 miles from Dakota Access. And for those of you who know environmental issues, know that Dakota Access led to a massive indigenous resistance at Standing Rock in North Dakota. And I happen to be a lawyer at Standing Rock for the water protectors, and then also helped convene the coalition here in Iowa and regionally that tried to fend off Dakota Access. But it was that experience, along with Enbridge Line 3 in Minnesota and Keystone right next door in Nebraska and South Dakota, that made me just really suspicious and worried about the CO2 pipelines. What could that possibly mean? So I wanted to run through this with you, in part because this is going to become a looming issue within the environmental movement, just like oil and gas pipelines. So I hope that this will give you at least the rudiments for engaging in your own resistance and struggles for climate change on behalf of future generations, and to do what the future demands of us. So let's see if this is going to actually work. Yes. So CO2 is unique. It is very different than oil and gas, and there are some significant ways that it's different. And I want you to fully understand that by the end of this. And you can yes but this all the way along. That's good practice for an activist. to challenge the kinds of things that I'm saying, so that you have the arguments in your backpack, your magic backpack, to actually resist. So I want to give you a key resource that was actually developed with Karen guidance. Karen is chair of a messaging committee for a larger CO2 coalition, carbon capture and storage coalition. So this website is the best science and information on carbon capture and storage that's out there. And it's put together, my organization, the Science and Environmental Health Network, has put it together, but it's under the aegis of a larger coalition that supports this and came together. So memorize this link, carboncapturefacts.org, and go visit it, rummage through it like you would your grandmother's attic or a science lab. Very useful information. So a couple of small caveats on this. One is I'm not going to cover the environmental issues of CO2 pipelines, and they're vast. I'm only going to talk about the public health issues. So that's a pretty narrow focus and not one I'm accustomed to separating out. You heard that I've been invested in the concept of ecological medicine. So the environment and public health are deeply entwined in my mind. But for the purposes of this particular presentation, I'm only going to talk about the public health effects. And so that will be a little bit broader and narrower in some ways than just the environmental issues. So what is carbon capture and storage? And that's the backdrop for all of this. Carbon capture and storage is a set of technologies that are rapidly developing, particularly in light of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Prior to that, in 2008 and onward, a number of the fossil fuel industries, coal, oil, have been trying to develop something called carbon capture and storage for use to cause green energy. So what is it? It's a technology that captures CO2, usually from the smokestacks of power plants or from ethanol plants or other facilities. They pressurize it into a supercritical liquid, and then they send it through a high pressure pipeline, pump it below ground in either what is called a Class 6 well, which has special regulations under US EPA, or they use it in enhanced oil recovery to get more oil from the earth. Usually enhanced oil recovery is employed in nearly depleted wells. And this lets them get the last drop out from those wells. So the background to this is that they are considered hazardous liquid pipelines. Up until very recently, they were in a gray area. They still are in a regulatory gray area because there are no Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration, the agency that would regulate these. They don't have any. And so we'll explore the implications of that in a little bit. But the difference between CO2 pipelines, and many of you may have worked on oil or gas pipelines. Gas pipelines are primarily regulated by FERC or permitted by FERC, and the Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission. In contrast to oil pipelines or hazardous liquid pipelines, which are given permits by the states. So in the case of, say, Dakota Access, which is a hazardous liquid pipeline, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois all had to give permits for those pipelines. This means that they're incredibly fragmented. Every state has different requirements for those. They are so idiosyncratic to the states, and then yet the pipeline companies put those together and build their pipelines. The corollary to the states regulating these is that the pipelines always say, well, the other states are going to, the other states already have, so you might as well, it's going to go through. And because it's so fragmented among so many agencies. So even though states regulate hazardous liquid pipelines like CO2 pipelines and oil pipelines, there are multiple agencies that have to get involved. The Army Corps of Engineers, the Federal Department of Transportation, the State Department of Transportation, the archaeologists. It goes on and on and on. And they are able to piece together the fact that no one really has final jurisdiction to say yay or nay. All of those decisions are so piecemeal that the likelihood of them just saying yes is much greater. So we watched that with Dakota Access and are seeing something very similar now with the CO2 pipelines that have been proposed in the Midwest. There are 3 that are proposed in the Midwest. One is touting that it will be the largest carbon capture and storage project in the United States, if not the world. So what I want to do in this talk is divide up the public health issues around 3 phases of the life of a pipeline. The public health issues are really different during construction, during operations, and then the long-term life of a pipeline. As you can see, there need to be warnings. These are dangerous. This is a picture of constructing a pipeline. As you can tell, that the major issues around construction of pipelines are twofold. This is just above the Des Moines drinking water, Des Moines River drinking water, the Des Moines River, which is the drinking water for the state capital of Iowa, Des Moines. And this is Dakota Access on a farmer property who they seized through eminent domain. So the major issues in the construction that are public health are actually occupational safety and health issues. So in 2016, they had a huge fatality rate that far exceeds the average American worker. And it averages 4.3 times the fatality rate for other workers. So this is a high risk proposition. If you're a construction worker, you have a much higher rate of dying on the job than if you were doing some other things. But one of the things that I want to highlight during construction of these pipelines is the increased risk of man camps and sex trafficking. So what we get are these large influxes of men from out of state. They don't hire in-state construction or security or much of anything. They bring them all in, they house them in these man camps. And then what we get is increases in sex trafficking. So this actually turns out to be a major public health issue and identified in an environmental impact statement to show how closely they're linked. Minnesota drafted an environmental impact statement that said there would be an increase in sex trafficking, particularly among Indigenous women and children, given the construction of Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands pipeline. And they went ahead and permitted it anyway, knowing that there would be an increase in sex trafficking. Now, we had quite a few incidences of solicitation in Iowa, offering men on farms, their choice of little girls, if they would sign eminent domain easements. So, this is a problem. And by the way, parenthetically, what we will see is this is a threat in all of our climate change problems. Anytime you're bringing in large groups of men and only men, or primarily men, for construction, reconstruction after a flood, what you get are increases in sex trafficking. So you can see some of the links below for information about both the occupational safety and health and the increases in sex trafficking that correspond to pipeline construction. So the operation of the CO2 pipelines. Once construction is done, by the way, construction is just hugely disruptive to the environment, hugely disruptive, which you know if you've been involved in this at all. Um, but the CO2 pipelines in their operation pose unique risks. And the reason is that CO2 is very different than either oil or natural gas. It is a known asphyxiant. The public is in grave danger if a CO2 pipeline ruptures. And this is really the biggest health risk of CO2 pipelines, and we'll explore this more fully. CO2 in contact with water, including your eyes or your the inside of your nose or mouth, becomes acidified. And so a leak near water can contaminate it and acidify it. Your drinking water, your own body, which is made up of so much water, can all become acid. And it poses unique challenges for emergency responders and healthcare workers. And most rural areas lack adequate resources to deal with either a rupture or a leak. So a CO2 toxicity is, you exhale it. What could the problem be? I mean, plants breathe it and give us oxygen in exchange. So why are we saying that this is so problematic? First, we know that it is both toxic and it can smother you. It's sort of like that invisible plastic bag. And it has no odor on its own. It has no odor. So you don't know what has assailed you if you are confronted or enveloped in a CO2 cloud. That very low concentrations, it can increase your rate of breathing at just a 2% concentration. It will increase how fast you're breathing. You're trying to get rid of that CO2. You're trying to get oxygen. You're trying to exhale that CO2. My colleague Sandra Steingraber, a biologist, says that this is very finely tuned. We have incredible mechanisms in our carotid arteries throughout our physiology for measuring and modulating the amount of CO2 that we have in our bodies. It is highly calibrated. We don't have to think about this. It is automatic. At 5% increases, your breathing rate becomes distressing and you develop a risk of respiratory acidosis. And at 7 to 10%, you can become unconscious and greater than 10% in less than a minute. So if that pipeline ruptures and explodes, you don't have time to get away. And you can see that as we go through that exposure under the National Institute for the Occupational Safety and Health standards, that exposure to 4% poses an immediate threat to life. So in contrast to oil, if it spills, the farmhouse next to it is not in danger. There might be a fire, but that's an entirely different thing than a cloud of CO2, which can kill you. As I mentioned, CO2 in water, it causes carbonic acid, which is a change in pH. It can mobilize heavy metals that are already in the water, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and uranium. It can leach organic compounds, including benzene and toluene and the rest, from organic matter present in the water. And its impacts on drinking water could be site-specific, depending on everything from local geology, the size of the leak, the kinds of bacteria. So the major point here is acid. It can acidify water. It is not a good thing to come in contact with water and very hard to clean up later. So, during the operation of a CO2 pipeline, if it should rupture, the public health infrastructure of first responders and the medical community have real unique challenges in dealing with this. CO2 displaces oxygen and it sinks. So it will fall close to the earth and then spread out in low-lying areas. So it's going to go downhill. It will hover and stay in valleys. And because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you don't know what's going on. Your engine, if you're driving, unless you've got a Tesla or one of the new electric vehicles, your internal combustion engine cannot run. So the ambulance that's sent to an accident site because people are all of a sudden walking zombies, their cars won't start. A farmhouse or a community that is faced with a CO2 pipeline rupture can't get away by the quickest means possible. And so this can result in potential mass casualties because it displaces oxygen and because the first responders have a very difficult time responding. They lack equipment and training. So, most of the first responders in rural communities have some idea of how to respond to anhydrous ammonia or to, an oil leak. Gasoline stations leak, there are diesel leaks. They know how to do that. But CO2 is so unique in this that it's problematic. And because for the most part, in places like Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, rural Iowa, Nebraska, where these major pipelines have been proposed initially, we will see them all across the country, but initially in these rural areas, rural hospitals are closing. They are far away from the nearest clinic or medical center, and those medical centers are not equipped for dealing with CO2 emergencies. So what happens when a pipeline ruptures? There's an explosive release of this supercritical liquid CO2, which explodes into a cloud of gas, and it's very cold. So dry ice, the CO2 can be a liquid, a gas, or a solid. And this rupture of the liquid makes it explode into a cloud of gas. And it will continue until the supply is either depleted or turned off. And as I mentioned, CO2 and hydrogen sulfide both are heavier than air and settle near the ground, displacing oxygen. So this is highly dangerous in populated areas, and the concentrations can disperse over quite a long way, depending on the topography, the pipeline size, and the extent of the rupture. So how do we know this? We know that this because of a major pipeline accident in Satartia, Mississippi in February of 2020. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But we have our best information about the problems associated with the dangers of a pipeline rupture from this accident in Satartia. So given the proposals for carbon capture and storage, especially with the tax credits that have been put into the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed, 10 days ago, what we surmise, what we know, what's been proposed is that there will be literally hundreds of thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines in the works if these corporations get their way. At present, right now, if we tried to inject or move all the supercritical CO2 that just comes from coal burning plants, we would be moving more CO2 liquids than the entire oil and gas industry today. And that's just for CO2. And at present, there are only 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines compared to 2.7 million miles of oil and gas pipelines. The contrast is pretty vast. The build out is pretty astonishing. Here is a map of the proposed pipeline build out, what they expect to have in the next 25 years. Look at, and I hope it's making you quake and renew your commitments to resisting these. So basically the last 10 years, there have been 66 accidents along those 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines. And the major accident by which we are, that we're using as a benchmark for what can happen was the one in Satartia, Mississippi, that just occurred in 2020. So here's a couple of pictures of what happened in Satartia. This is what was left, the white residue, and then essentially that landscape afterwards. So what you're going to hear is, oh, the CO2 from ethanol plants is so clean. You exhale CO2. This is no problem. Just go back to playing bridge with your friends and eating your bacon in the diner, and just let us, bring these financial benefits to your community. And the fact is, the ethanol plants have relatively pure CO2. And some of the other sources of CO2, which will be much more difficult to apply carbon capture and storage to them because of the contamination of the CO2, have things like hydrogen sulfide. And you will hear that the accident at Satartia, the health effects were actually caused by the hydrogen sulfide that naturally occurred with the CO2 in the Denbury pipeline in Satartia. But according to PHMSA, the main pipeline safety agency, said that there was no hydrogen sulfide in the tests, the air monitoring tests at Satartia. And so the symptoms of the victims all were much more similar to what you would expect with carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide levels were still elevated days later in the victims who sought medical help. So the argument that it was the hydrogen sulfide that caused the health problems is false, according to PHMSA, not according to environmentalists like me who they think that we have an axe to grind. That is, it is false. The other thing about it is hydrogen sulfide actually has a smell. And so that this is not a good thing to, you can smell it, that there's a problem, you try to get away from it. But with CO2 and no odor, you actually may increase the risk of harm because you don't know that you have actually inhaled something. All you know is that you're in trouble. You don't know why. You don't know the source. You have no idea what's going on. So the hydrogen sulfide is a double-edged sword. And based on the investigation that PHMSA did on Satartia, they decided that they would actually draft CO2 pipeline regulations. Now, you might be looking at me and saying, wait a minute. What do you mean they're going to build out all these CO2 pipelines and we don't have federal regulations? That's what I'm telling you. There are no federal regulations right now for CO2 pipelines. And to make matters worse, we don't even have the science that we need to make the regulations, to draft the regulations. What should the engineering specs be? How far should the setbacks be? We don't know. And so PHMSA has actually put out a request for proposals. And I think that they have made the grants for the research. on which they will base the regulations. But those were just commissioned this summer. So we do not expect the science to be done for a year or two, and then the regulations, I doubt, will be available before 2025. So California just passed a major climate bill just a couple of days ago. And they wisely recognized that because there are no federal regulations in place, that they will not allow all of their carbon capture projects to go forward if they require pipelines until PHMSA has drafted these. So I put the language in the that appeared in the California legislation, and so it does not apply to carbon capture and storage that where it's just captured and then put below ground at a facility or on someone's property. But it only applies to CO2 pipelines because of their unique properties and the fact that there are no existing federal regulations. So pipeline companies in places like Iowa and the Midwest are arguing that PHMSA, they're arguing two things. One is that they're saying the states can't regulate this because PHMSA does, and yet PHMSA doesn't have regulations. So they're just telling the states to go ahead, that they will do due diligence, they will do everything that's the right thing to do, even though there are no federal standards. The pipeline companies cannot have this both ways. And so our conclusion for this talk is that we need to stand firm. States should not grant permits for any CO2 pipelines until PHMSA has completed its regulations and drafted those safety standards. We think that this is the only logical, the only science-based approach to these CO2 pipelines. And we will be working to make sure that no CO2 pipelines go forward until, and maybe not even then, until we have those federal standards drafted and the science in place. So that concludes my my presentation, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. I really appreciate it. I mean, it was an excellent talk, very comprehensive. And I know that we're probably going to have a lively discussion with the audience here. But I wanted to start out with one question that I've been wondering about myself, because so much of the carbon that has been captured over the last many decades has been used for enhanced oil recovery. Sequestration hasn't been job one when they're capturing carbon, and now that that's what they're talking up anyhow, is how is that part of it being regulated once it's through the pipeline and it ends up at some sequestration point, some injection well, like a class 6 injection well?
One of the things that people should know is that every phase of carbon capture and storage, the capture part, the pipeline part, the storage or enhanced oil recovery part, all are regulated differently.
Mm-hmm.
Put together all these regulations, but both the federal government and the states are saying that carbon capture and storage is in the public interest. So Nebraska passed a law that says carbon capture and storage is in the public interest. All these states are saying want to do this. The federal government, with Department of Energy, has also said so. So what they're going to do is minimize regulations. The storage part, either the deep well injection or the enhanced oil recovery, have different regulations under US EPA. So enhanced oil recovery are considered class 2 wells and have minimal requirements, including financial requirements, insurance, for in case of accidents and that kind of thing. But class 6 wells are more stringently regulated. However, states can now apply for what's called primacy.
Mhm.
And they can regulate the deep well injection for sequestration or storage. Now, the added problem to this is that different entities own the waste product. CO2 is a waste product, unless you grant enhanced oil recovery. And then it's it's a useful asset to get more oil out. But as a waste product, these CO2 pipelines are essentially a sewer system for the fossil fuel industry. And the states almost all take ownership of the CO2 when it hits the wells. North Dakota takes ownership in 10 years. Illinois apparently takes it instantly. It's the well, Illinoisans own it. And so what this means is, in addition to the 45Q tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, which are going to pay companies for every ton of CO2, then the public owns and is liable for the CO2 that hits the ground. Now, an added problem is, at this point, there are no good monitoring or verification processes in place or laws in place for how much has been injected, how much has been stored, how much is leaked. And the credits are traded all over the place, bought and sold. Companies can slice and dice these in many ways. But and there's no way to track those credits at this point and know if people are double dipping. So it turns out that because these are tax credits, what we are essentially doing is environmental policy by tax policy, environmental policy by tax policy, rather than regulating. We're giving them tax credits. The taxes are confidential and private information. The public will not know how much the credits have been given. We will not have good information. And at present, corporations have to report to US EPA and to the IRS the CO2 that has been sequestered. And there have been discrepancies. There's been more reported to the IRS, meaning more people have gotten tax credits than has actually been reported to the EPA as climate solutions. So the regulation is problematic from soup to nuts.
I asked because so many states are going through that primacy fight right now, and I was just curious. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to this; it's ridiculous. And one question that Bridget asked in the chat was, "Can we trust the entities chosen to do the science for PHMSA, or are they biased industry sources that are doing the science?"
We don't know who the contracts were given to. But here's the bigger worry. They did not have a lot of money to grant. And so a lot of this is a literature review. So the worry is actually that they're not doing field testing. They're not doing, the kind of engineering tests. It looks like the Europeans are a little bit ahead of us on some of this research. But my bigger worry is that they have not actually commissioned the research that they need to actually promulgate real safety. PHMSA, the bigger problem is PHMSA is not accustomed to a lot of public scrutiny, and we intend to change that with the CO2 pipeline regulations. So stay tuned for that, and we hope that you'll participate in this.
I wanted to jump back to Anne's question from the very beginning. and she was asking about the health impacts of CO2 toxicity. How does that compare to carbon monoxide?
Um, I don't know that. I'm assuming that they're probably similar, but I don't know that. We don't concentrate carbon monoxide anywhere and force it through pipelines, as far as I know. So you know, when we encounter carbon monoxide, it's in your basement, your bad furnace, or having used your charcoal grill in Texas to keep warm. Um, but uh, we don't do anything like take massive quantities of carbon monoxide and uh, put it through a pipeline. So that's the difference here.
True.
And I would defer that to the doctor on our staff, Shetler, to ask.
And Mary asks about the fatality stats that you had provided. What are the main causes of fatalities for workers?
Well, I think earth caving in on them, machine accidents, that are using hugely heavy equipment um, uh, at these sites. It's just vast. The earth collapsing on them, that kind of stuff.
And this is another one from Mary. Do you know of health effects for any oil and or gas pipelines being reutilized for CO2?
That's much more complex, but the the probability that the stats, the engineering requirements, the kind of metal that's used in pipelines um, will not lend themselves to being retrofitted to CO2, which has unique properties. Any contaminants, a little bit of water, and it's far more corrosive. So the retrofitting is a complicated issue. And at this point, we do not know if PHMSA will be addressing that. We're hoping so. But it doesn't look like it's a great idea. Just because of the different properties of oil and gas compared to CO2 and its corrosive nature.
And I just directed over to the Q&A where there are a couple of questions. A lot of them are in chat, so I'm just checking back. So there's another worker-related question, and having to do with are you observing workers in the industry expressing concern about their health, safety, and quality of life?
And what we're seeing is a pretty strong labor push for these CO2 pipelines. And it has caused obviously some political difficulty in places where these CO2 pipelines are being proposed. But no, the pipe fitters are saying, this is our livelihood. These are our jobs. We want them. And so there's been some acrimony over that. I will say that Leona, the main union for pipe fitters, has been actually sponsored and a lot of paid for by the Koch brothers. So the cross political wins are impressive.
And here's one about the Inflation Reduction Act, although I would ask you to include the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act if you can. But the question is, do you think the bulk of the climate emissions reductions in IRA, but I would say again IAJ as well, is based on carbon capture false solution projections, or do you think there's a substantial real reduction methodology not based on carbon capture?
So there's a subtle answer to this. And that is that the financial incentives for carbon capture and storage, they assumed that we were going to start incentivizing things like cement plants. The problem is we are not structuring the payments under the IRA um, so that it's the cost of putting on carbon capture and storage. It's they're getting it per ton of CO2. So there are much easier places to put carbon capture and storage on that is really cheap for the companies. Ethanol plants come at the top of the list. And the profits that they will make are so vast compared to a cement plant or the other things that are hard, that we have to have and are essential. And so when you look at where investment's going to go for profit making, it's going to go to things like ethanol, which are going to prop up these industries. And then the ethanol companies get to sell their ethanol into the low carbon fuel standard markets, which are adding premiums on for ethanol produced with low carbon, with carbon capture and storage. So the amount of profit built into this even means that when they use it for oil recovery, they're going to go with the least common denominator. The other thing is they can put it now on coal burning power plants and other things and keep those coal companies alive. So North Dakota has a huge carbon capture and storage project on a coal burning power plant. Now they will get IRA tax credits for that, which will keep that coal burning plant alive. And they are very close to oil wells in the Bakken. They can then sell their oil and their CO2 to get more oil out. And so the incentives, the financial incentives are actually all backwards. It is to prop up the oil and gas industry. It is the way that they're structured for solar and wind are entirely different. It's so the profits are just completely skewed for maintaining oil and gas, completely skewed. The profits are going to be unbelievable. Billions of dollars per year per pipeline in Iowa. Billions. Coming from the 45Q tax credit.
Well, I was asking also about the IIJA because I happen to know from something I'm working on, and you probably know better than I do, but IIJA in terms of just providing money to invest into these projects, put something like $20 billion into hydrogen and carbon capture projects combined, but a grand total, this actually surprised me, 480 million for all renewables combined in that just that one bill, and that's before IRA and all of the 45Q boost and all of that other thing. It's like we're on a suicide mission or something. Is this government is directing us anyhow?
We are going to pay them to pollute. So
Yeah.
CO2 is a pollution, and we're going to pay them to collect their own garbage, and then we are going to own it. This is nonsense. And if I knew you all better, I would say this is bullshit.
I'm going to take myself off camera because you've been breaking up since I went back on, and I'm hoping that it's me. So let me just stop my video, but I'll continue to ask the questions. So continue to put them in the chat, and another one came into the Q&A box, and that is from Lisa, a follow-up to her last question. Do you think there is anything substantial that is not false solutions in the IRA that will really benefit climate emission mitigation?
Sure. All of the the renewable structures, financing structures, the benefit for jobs, all of that is great. The problem is the overriding carbon capture and storage just is so weighted financially that it's going to overshadow the rest. But yes, the support for renewables was amazing and wonderful. And what you're seeing in the larger environmental community is that division of whoever dreamed that we would get that kind of money for renewables, especially, tied to jobs in such a wonderful way. And at the same time, the double whammy of carbon capture and storage. Bribery is not a bad, it's funded corruption that we're going to just turn the, yeah, I think it's Karen's sound that is causing the background noise.
Yeah, I have this problem. In fact, I tried to fix it and I was cut off completely, so I missed part of the middle of your presentation. I'll try to go on mute in between asking questions. I don't know how to fix my computer, otherwise it causes this problem sometimes. Let's see. There was a discussion going on a little bit in the chat here about shouldn't we be cutting the use of ethanol anyway, especially from food crops?
So I have an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times along with Sherry Deal-Tyne that came out in August. And we essentially argue that incentivizing ethanol is a terrible environmental plan. So we agree that ethanol needs to be phased out and that this builds a vast amount of infrastructure that will keep ethanol going for a long time when it needs to be phased out. We're not raising food. We're essentially raising gasoline with our corn in Iowa. And the subsidiary problems associated with ethanol, we have some of the dirtiest water in the United States, in Iowa, from the pesticides and especially the fertilizers used in those crops. And then we're causing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So we agree completely that this is a terrible idea. What's interesting about the politics of that is that the ethanol farmer, the farmers who are raising corn for ethanol in Iowa have said, we don't think ethanol is the long-term solution. And the pipeline companies and the corn growers have said, this is, God's answer to agriculture, which is the heartbeat of Iowa. And the farmers themselves are saying, you're going to seize our farms through eminent domain, and you're going to destroy the farms. You saw what they do to the soil in that picture that I showed you of Dakota Access's construction. They destroy those farms, and they are not repaired. So we're losing agricultural capacity even to produce the corn for ethanol. Ethanol is a terrible idea. Yesterday, Reuters issued a report that ethanol is actually dirtier than gasoline. And we'll see how that factors into California and the other states' low carbon fuel standards. So stay tuned. Ethanol is a hot debate. And I agree with you that it's not a good idea. We should be raising food and should be raising good food, not the kind of junk that all of this entails. I'm going to answer the wildlife, the plant life question. It can smother it, and it can because of the acid, and the cold when it releases, it can kill plant life as well. It will kill any wildlife that's affected by it too. So not a good thing for living things.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all the questions that we had. I don't want to create background noise anymore. And so I want to thank you though so much for speaking with us today. And I'm looking forward to seeing the fact sheet you mentioned at the very beginning. And I also want to note for people here in the East that the op-ed that Carolyn just referred to was republished or reprinted in the Atlantic City newspaper of all places. And so I had shared that link around, but we can share it again. It was an excellent op-ed. But thank you so much for doing this, Carolyn. I'll see you in an hour. And have a great. Oh, you know what? Before we go, Gourmet Magazine. Explain that connection quickly.
Well, at the time that Gourmet magazine did that story, my husband and I were on our farm in North Dakota. We have a farm in North Dakota. Uh, uh, and at the time, it's 3,500 acres of organic uh, plants and crops and animals. So I have a vested interest in the kind of agriculture that we see in Iowa because of the contrast on our beautiful, beautiful farm in North Dakota. My husband's very well known in the sustainable agriculture field. His name is Fred Kirshenman, if you want to look him up. And Gourmet Magazine came out to do an interview with him and me. Fred had done an incredible presentation with the Chefs Collaborative, which was part of the bringing together of farmers and chefs across the country. And we've had a long partnership with some of the great chefs in the United States. For those of you in New York, Fred was president of Stone Barns. If you know Dan Barber's great restaurant, Blue Hill, Alice Waters in California, a number of other chefs. So they came out and visited us. And Fred, by the way, Sally, was that Fred helped create Stone Barns. He was part of the visioning, and then he was the president up until I think 2 years ago. And he just retired as a board member this past year. So I do want to say that when I go to sleep and wake up at 3 a.m. with all my anxieties, it's remembering that I actually cooked for Gourmet Magazine, and I've cooked for Dan Barber. So you think, are you a complete idiot? And that's probably proof that I am. But I enjoy food, and I enjoy the kind of food that we produced on our beautiful, beautiful farm. I raised all my food in North Dakota except for poultry and dairy, down to popcorn, and even raised indoor citrus. So I have a long history of making beautiful food. And it turns out my relationship to Dan Barber is part of the reason that kale became popular in the United States. There were 2 chefs that picked up kale. Dan was one of them, wrote a recipe for Bon Appetit after Fred and I introduced him to kale. And that recipe took off. So I actually consider kale to probably be the next messiah. I think that plants have definitely salvific qualities, and kale is one of my favorites. So that's the story.
Well, thank you so much. That's great. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that to us. And again, uh, everybody, I don't know if you're seeing the chat, but people are all thanking you very much for all of this information you provided us with today. Thank you so much, and I'll say goodbye to everyone and see you in an hour, Carolyn. Thank you again.